Hello everybody, this is the first of two videos for chapter 7 of the statistical learning class. So the objective of this chapter is to introduce unsupervised learning methods for clustering. Okay, so we've discussed early on the difference between unsupervised learning and supervised learning. Supervised learning is where you try to find a pattern in the data where a right answer is given. So you try to predict a response based on predictors, and you have training data where the response is deemed the right answer in your data set, and then you want to link the predictors to the response. Conversely, in unsupervised learning, you attempt to find a structure within the data, but that structure there does not rely on a correct answer for training. So the algorithm aims to find a suitable pattern in the data without being told or trained by using the right answer. So clustering, we will describe the clustering problem next, but we will see two main methods within this chapter for clustering. The first one is the Kmeans algorithm, and the second one is hierarchical clustering. So the chapter presents part of chapter 10 from the ISL textbook and parts of chapter 14 from the more advanced ESL textbook. So as we just mentioned, in supervised learning, we typically train a model from a training data set where the correct answer is given for each observation, and we want to train the model by replicating, by helping him learn how to replicate these correct answers. So in unsupervised learning, there's no response in the data. You have only predictors, if we can say so. You have no correct answer. You want to find a meaningful structure in the data or discover meaningful patterns without being told what the patterns should look like. So there are numerous unsupervised learning methods in practice which apply to different types of problem, but what we will discuss in this chapter is clustering. So clustering is a problem where you aim at regrouping observations with similar predictors. Okay, so similar observations, you try to regroup them together and form groups of observations so as to understand what the groups look like. Examples of clustering problem could include the following. So the first one, we've mentioned that earlier in chapter 1. So if you have various animals and you have their DNA sequence and you know their genes, you might want to classify them into various species. And of course, there's no correct answer about what should be the ultimate classification. That classification is subjective, but you'd like to find one which makes sense and help you analyze how animals are similar or dissimilar to each other. Another problem is if you study sports. So if you are given the statistics of a hockey player, you might want to find which players are similar together. So for example, if you're an agent, then you might, and you negotiate the salary of your player, you might want to know which are the comparable people within the league. So you want to know, for example, if the players are regrouped together, maybe some groups are more offensive players, some groups are more defensive players. Some players, let's say if you're a forward, you might be either a passer or a shooter. Are you a safe player? Are you a risky player? So based on your statistics, you can aim to regroup similar players together so as to help you understand what are the how can you represent these groups of player from a few concepts, let's say. Okay, so what we will do next is to present a formal clustering problem, which will be solved with the well-known K-means clustering algorithm. So assume we have a data set with p predictors for each observation. Okay, you have endpoints, each containing p observations. So here x1 until x11 until x1p is the set of all predictors for observation 1, and xn1 until xnp is the set of all predictors for observation n. And again, here there's no response variable, so we want to find the pattern within the predictors instead of linking predictors to some response variable. So the objective here is to take the original set of data points and try to split them into capital K groups, where here we're going to assume that capital K is chosen in advance. Okay, so in practice, if you want to do clustering, K is not necessarily predetermined beforehand, so you might want to test various values of capital K, but here for the purpose of explanations, let's assume capital K is fixed. So more precisely, our objective is to separate the set of all observations in the data set into capital K clusters, C1 until Ck, and clusters are a subset of observations where you first want that the union of all clusters is the set of all observations. So all observations are classified, and furthermore, if we have two distinct clusters, I and j, then their intersection have to be null. So in a sense, like clustering is finding a suitable partition of the set of observation. Okay, and the idea here is we like that all observations falling into one cluster should have some degree of similarity. Okay, so we hope that within a cluster, players are sufficiently similar to each other, and across two clusters, we like players, I'm referring to the hockey example, but data points to be dissimilar when we go from one cluster to the other. Okay, so the idea, as we just said, is if you want to do clustering, a good clustering is one for which the within cluster variation is as small as possible. Okay, so the within cluster variation is a measure of variability of observations within that cluster. And if you have clusters where all observations are similar within the cluster, then the within cluster variation should be as small as possible. Okay, so often, and what we're gonna present next, WCK represents the within cluster variation of cluster CK. Okay, so to represent the within cluster variation W, so what is the function W we're going to use? Of course, there are many possible choices. So what we'll do, we'll use the one proposed in the textbook, which is standard, so which is a common choice. So the textbook proposes to use the within cluster variation as 1 over the cardinality of Ck. So this is 1 over the number of observations in cluster K times a sum over all observations I and I prime in Ck. Okay, so here we have only one summation symbol, but it's indeed a double summation where we sum over all i's and all I primes of the squared Euclidean norm between, or Euclidean, so this is the squared Euclidean distance between point xi and xi prime. So basically, the within cluster variation is you sum across all possible combinations of points I and I prime, their Euclidean distance between each other. And you normalize by the number of points. Okay, so here, just to notice, here there's the number of terms is in this summation. It's not the cardinality of Ck, it's the cardinality of Ck squared. So why here is it only the cardinality of Ck instead of being that squared? Well, we'll see that next, where we can derive alternative representations for this intercluster variation. But the idea here is if all the points within the cluster Ck are similar, their Euclidean distances will be very small, and this within cluster variation will also be very small. Conversely, if points are far away from each other within the cluster, then the within cluster variation will be large. So what's proposed in the textbook is to try to find a cluster, so a set of clusters C1 until Ck, for which would minimize the following objective function. Okay, so we'd like to find clusters C1 until Ck, which are disjoint and where their union is the total set of observation, which minimize the following objective function, where the objective function is defined as the sum across all clusters of within cluster variations. Okay, so if we have a good clustering, it means that in each cluster, observations are pretty similar to each other. So all within cluster variations should be small, so their sum across all clusters should also be small. This problem, in practice, it would be very hard to solve exactly. Okay, because how many possible partitions of all observations can be obtained? Well, there are many possibilities. Okay, so for example, if each observation can be in cluster 1, 2, 3 until capital K, then there are k to the power n possible ways to assign the various observations into the cluster. Okay, so each observation has n k possible choices of cluster, and since there's n observation, there's k to the power n possible assignations to the various clusters. Of course, within these assignations, some would lead to I'd say equivalent cluster. So if you just relabel cluster, maybe these assignations would be the same, but still the total number is very large. So so solving this approach exactly in practice, if the number is very large and number n is very large, it might be unfeasible. So the approach we're going to do is the following. Instead of finding the perfect solution, we will be happy with a sufficiently good one. Okay, so we won't try to solve exactly that problem, but we'll try instead to get what we call a local solution. And when we say local solution, we'll make that more precise in a few slides. Okay, so we will propose to solve the problem, try to solve the problem at least. We'll propose what we call the Kmeans algorithm, and we will show that the Kmeans algorithm converges to a solution which is not the optimal solution, but rather a local solution, which hopefully is good enough. So we now outline the various steps for the Kmeans algorithm. So the first step, well, in fact, there are two steps. Okay, the first step is pretty simple. It's to the initialization of the algorithm, where at the initial step, we're simply going to assign all observations, each observation randomly to one of the clusters. Okay, so you pick observation first, you select, you randomly assign it to a cluster, take observation 2, you randomly assign it to a cluster, etc., until initially all observations are assigned to some cluster. Okay, so you have your current clusters right now, and then step 2 is to iterate the following procedure until convergence. So you iterate until the cluster assignments stop changing. So this step 2 has two substeps. The first substep is for each cluster, you look at all, for example, let's pick one of the clusters. For that cluster, you would compute the centroid of that cluster. And what is the centroid? The centroid is simply the sample average of all points within this cluster. Okay, so each point corresponds to a vector with p observations. So you can take the sample average, which is a vectorial average, and the sample average would correspond to the centroid of that cluster. And you do that for each cluster. So you have capital K clusters, then you have capital K centroids computed at the end of this step. So once you have the capital K clusters or centroids for each cluster, then the second substep involves reassigning each of the data points to the various clusters. And how you do that is by looking at the distance between the, so for one given data point, how do you assign it to any of the cluster? Well, you take that data point, you compute the distance between that data point and each of the centroids of each cluster, and then you will assign that data point to the cluster whose centroid's distance is the smallest. Okay, so if data point 1 is closer to the centroid of cluster 1 than to the centroid of all other clusters, then you will assign this new the observation, sorry, not new observation, but this observation to cluster 1. And you do that for all observations until all of them are reassigned to the clusters. And you iterate like this until convergence. So once you've reassigned observations to all clusters, then you recompute the centroids for each cluster by averaging all observations within each respective cluster. And then once you do that, again, once you have centroids, you reassign the observations to the various clusters, and you do like that until eventually the algorithm will stabilize and stop varying. So when this happens, then you're done. Okay, the algorithm has converged, and this is your clustering you've obtained. Okay, so here, why do we call it K-means? Well, it's pretty logical name based on the algorithm. It's because on each iteration, you have to recompute the centroids of each cluster, and these centroids are means or averages of observations. So on each step, you have K means to recompute. So it's logical to call this approach K-means. One quick note here, so in the step 1, the initialization step, we mentioned earlier that a typical way to proceed is to take each observation individually and randomly assign them to the various clusters. Well, there's another way to do that which can be pursued, which is to randomly simulate data points within the predictor space and use them as initial cluster centroids for the various clusters. Okay, so at step 1, what you can do is randomly sample points which would add as centroids, and then in that step you would then assign each of the observations to the various clusters based on the closest centroids, and these would be your initial cluster. Okay, so this is in this remark here, it's another way to do the initialization, where instead of completely randomly assigning the observations to the clusters, you can randomly generate points which would act as centroids in your initialization and then assign observations to them. Okay, so here we're going to provide a simple example using simulated data from R. Okay, so let's say we have a simulated data set where for each data point there's exactly 2 predictors or 2 explanatory variables, x1 and x2. So here we're in the case p is equal to 2, so we have 2 predictors. We'll also try to apply the K-means with capital K is equal to 2, so we'll want to split the overall population into 2 subgroups. And we will illustrate the first 4 iterations of the K-means to observe how it behaves in practice. Okay, so if you look at the data set, well, it's pretty intuitive to expect that the 2 groups you should try to identify are the following. So the first group should be this set of points, this cloud of points here, and the second group, probably it should end up being this cloud of points. Okay, so logically, just through eyeball statistics without making any algorithm or formal computation, it would make sense to separate these into one group here and second group here. So let's see how the K-means algorithm behaves in that case. Okay, so we start with the initialization, and for this we followed the approach outlined in the previous remark. So initially, 2 random points were sampled completely randomly to act as centroids in the initialization. Okay, so this point was simulated for the blue cluster, so here cluster 1 will be the blue cluster and cluster 2 will be the orange cluster. Okay, so please note the blue and orange, they're not the response variables in the data set. They're just used to represent points assigned to cluster 1 in blue are points assigned to cluster orange in blue, in cluster 2 in orange. Okay, so these points were randomly simulated. So for the blue cluster, the point was simulated there. For the orange cluster, the point was simulated there. And then what happened is initially, all the points which were closer to this cluster, to this point than this one, were assigned to the blue cluster. And all points which were closer to this point rather than this point were assigned to the orange cluster. Okay, so this is the initialization where all points are assigned to a cluster initially. And then when we do that, the next step involves recalculating centroids. Okay, so here, if you pick all the points here, you can do their sample average to get the centroid, and then the centroid is the average of all such points, which is there. Whereas for the second cluster, if you average all these points, the average was there. So then this is the first iteration, and then we can continue like this. So the next step, once we have these new centroids, is to reassign the points to the various clusters. So if we do that, then some data points here, which were in the orange cluster before, now they're closer to this centroid, so they become assigned to the blue cluster. And here, all points which are closer to this one are assigned to orange, and etc. So once you do this, then on the next step, you recompute the centroid. So you recompute the sample average of all the blue points, which is here, of all the orange point, and it's here. And then when you're here, again, you reassign points. So let's say these points here, they're now closer to this centroid than this one. So you will reassign them to the blue cluster. Okay, so if you do that, you obtain this and this as a new assignation of points. Then based on these, you recompute centroids again. So if you average all the blue points, the centroid is now there. If you average all the orange points, it's now there. And you can continue like this. Here we see that the blue points are here. Here, if you recompute centroids, they're there. And eventually, so I haven't outlined the next few steps, but it's like probably the algorithm would have stopped in a few iterations. So here we were at iteration 4, but probably by iteration 6 or 7 or something like that, it would have converged where all these points here would be in one cluster, the blue cluster, and all these points would be in the orange cluster. Okay, so we can see how it works in practice, and in this particular case where the cloud of points are pretty separated from each other, this would work very well. Okay, so what about theoretical properties of the Kmeans algorithm? It can be shown that the Kmeans algorithm is guaranteed to decrease the objective function at each iteration. So it's impossible that you reassign, for example, you do an iteration where you recompute centroids and reassign observations to clusters, where this would increase the objective function. No, if you follow Kmeans, the objective function should be monotonically decreasing until it reaches a floor, or until convergence where it's going to stay stable. Okay, so I won't provide the proof here, but the proof is in the exercises. So please do the exercises to show this feature of the Kmeans algorithm. Okay, so the Kmeans is certain to decrease the objective function on each iteration, where recall the objective function is the sum across all clusters of the within cluster variation for that cluster. Okay, so in Kmeans, this objective function is constantly decreasing until it reaches a minimum, but the minimum here, it might not be the global minimum of the problem. So the solution might be good enough and you converge there, but it might not be the optimal solution to a problem for which the within cluster variation might be smaller. Okay, so let's say this is the amount of the optimal within cluster variation, then you might decrease here, but you might never reach that optimum below. Okay, and at some point you will have a flat function. Okay, so one thing that is important to notice is the clusters obtained when running the Kmeans algorithm, they depend on the initial clusters used in step 1 during the initialization. Okay, so if you initialize the initial clusters differently, then you might get a different solution. Okay, so this is why we claim that the solution provided by the Kmeans is local. It's because it doesn't converge to the best solution, but it does converge to solution which where the algorithm stops improving at some point, and then you converge to that and stay there. Okay, but because of that, in practice, the approach depends. The outcome depends on your initial clusters you've used in the initialization. So in practice, what's recommended is to try running multiple times the K-means algorithm with multiple different initializations. So once you do that, you can compare the solutions with various initializations selected, and then pick the solution across all these possible initializations, which leads to the smallest possible objective function. Okay, so one quick lemma which is used in the proof where the objective function is constantly decreasing is the following. Okay, so it can be shown, and again, this result in itself, it's not necessarily super useful, but it is useful to prove this other result in the exercise that I mentioned earlier, to show that the objective function constantly decreases. Okay, so this auxiliary result says that for each individual predictor P, and for each of the clusters small k from 1 to k, then 1 over the number of observations in cluster K times this double summation of squared Euclidean distance between pairs of the jth predictor of the observations within the cluster is equal to twice times the sum across all observations. And here it's not a double summation, it's a single summation anymore. It's not a double summation anymore, it's really a single summation here. So this is a double summation, this is a single summation. So the single summation of the jth predictor for the ith observation in the cluster minus the sample average within the cluster K of the jth predictor, where here the sample average of jth predictor in cluster K is simply the sample average. So you divide by the number of observations in cluster K, sum across all observations of the jth predictor for each of such observations in cluster CK. So we can see that summing the squared Euclidean distance within a cluster and dividing by the number of observations in that cluster is equal to twice times the sum across all observations of the cluster of the Euclidean distance between the jth predictor and the average predictor, the average predictor of the average jth predictor in cluster CK. Okay, and why is that useful? Well, recall that this guy was a building block of the within cluster variation. Okay, so the within cluster variation we've considered here simply involves summing this expression over all predictors J. Because recall, so let's draw here. So WCK was equal to 1 over, I'll write cardinality, but this is just the cardinality of CK. So this is this guy times the summation across all I and I prime, which are observations within cluster K, of the squared Euclidean distance between xi and xi prime. So here, what happens here is this guy is simply the summation across all predictors J of xi j minus xi prime j squared. Or you can put parentheses here. Okay, so we can see that the intercluster variation for cluster K is simply this expression that is summed across all predictors j here. Okay, so we can see that the within cluster variation can have an alternative representation where we replace this summation here by a summation of here, and this entails that WCK here is equal to, so if you sum this guy across all j's, it becomes twice times the summation of I, so all observations in CK, times the square distance between xi and I'll just call it x tilde k, where x tilde k here, it is the centroid. Okay, so it's the centroid of the cluster. So it shows that the within cluster variation is twice times the summation between for all observations within the cluster of the distance between the observation and its centroid. Okay, so it shows another representation of the within cluster variation, and here this is why we had 1 over cardinality instead of 1 over cardinality square. It's because it allows this quantity to just vanish here. So this expression might be a bit more telling sometimes, and we can use that in subsequent computations when we prove the previous theorem. Okay. So this lemma, we will give the proof right now. Okay, so we'll do a bit of calculation just to make sure we're comfortable with manipulating concepts associated with this clustering method. Okay, so here, on the left hand side, let's just forget about this 1 over cardinality and let's just consider this guy here. So this guy here, the sum, double summation across all observations in cluster K of the square distance between the jth predictor of observation I and jth predictor of observation I prime. So what we can do to go from here to here, we simply subtract and add back the average value of predictor j within that cluster, and then we can simply expand the square, where this guy, it's this difference squared plus this difference squared plus the cross term, which is twice this difference times this difference. Okay, so double summation of these three terms. And here what we see is that first term doesn't depend on I prime. There's no I prime here. So because of that, when we sum across all primes, I prime, this is constant with respect to I prime. So this summation is simply the number of terms here, which is the cardinality of CK, times this. So it's cardinality of CK times the summation across all i's of this square difference. Same thing here when we look at this term. When we sum that across all observations I, so we can interchange the order of the two summation, and when we sum this across all observations I, this is constant with respect to I, so it's simply the number of terms in the summation, cardinality of CK, times the sum of the square difference with respect to I prime. And here, what remains here is the cross term. So what happens when we double sum this expression? Well, what happens here is that this first term here, xij minus x bar kj, this doesn't depend on I prime. So basically, so if we have something like summation of twice a, I over a prime, something, let's call it ai bi prime, where a and b are, ai depends on I and bi prime depends on b prime. This is equal to, so we can take the ai and put it in front. So this is twice times ai times summation of bi prime. over I prime. So if we can do that, we take this first term in front of the I prime summation, and we end up with, okay, so here there should be a 2, sorry about that, but it doesn't matter because this term is going to disappear eventually. So 2 times this, and here we enter the summation with respect to I prime inside, so it becomes summation with respect to I prime of this difference here. And when you sum all these terms with respect to I prime, well, the sum of all predictors j within the cluster is simply equal to the sum of the average. Okay, so when you sum all observations, it's always equal to the sum of the average, because the average, it's a constant value, and sum of the average is simply the sum of the jth predictor. So this summation here becomes 0, and this term completely vanishes. So I forgot the 2 here, but it doesn't matter because the 2 just disappears. And what we obtain here finally is this guy. Okay, so are we done? Well, the next thing we're going to do, I'm going to show it here just to make it more simple, but provide the result on the next slide. Here we can just do some relabeling. So I prime here, we can simply call it I instead. Whoops, not I prime. We can simply call it I and replace this I prime by I. And we see that this term here and this term here would be exactly identical. So this whole expression is exactly twice this guy. Okay, so what we obtain ultimately is just twice this guy. Okay, so as we said, we obtained this, and we saw that the 2 terms are identical, so it's just twice this guy, which is twice times the cardinality of cluster K of the sum across all observations in CK of the jth predictor of observation I minus the sample average of the jth predictor, and we're done. So this completes our proof, which is great news. Okay. So here, this shows that the objective function, which we define as the sum across all clusters of the within cluster variation. So here, this guy, oops, not this guy, but this guy here, it's the Euclidean distance between xi and xi prime. Prime, that is squared. Okay, so it shows that we can replace this guy with the previous expression, and we can come up with the objective function, which can be expressed by this summation. So it's twice the sum across all clusters, and the sum across all predictors, and sum across all observations within that predictor of the squared difference between the jth predictor of observation I and the sample average of predictor J in cluster K squared. Okay, so we see that our original function can be rewritten in an alternative way, and this maybe sometimes it's easier to see it like that. So it's twice times the sum across all clusters times the sum across all observations within clusters of here xi, this Euclidean distance between the ith point, and here, where here this is the centroid with respect to observation K, to cluster K. Okay. So basically what we just did is we showed that we had an initial definition for the intercluster variation, which was intuitive, and we can express in an alternative way based on this result. And this other way of expressing it, it's also intuitive, but it's also convenient to derive some proofs. Okay, so here, based on that corollary, in the exercises you can use that to show that the objective function never increases in any iteration. So it's possible to show that when you apply k-means, on each iteration, the objective function can either decrease or maybe remain the same. Okay, so this means that as the algorithm runs, the clustering obtained will continually improve until the result no longer changes. And once you've stabilized to some result, then you have a local solution. Okay, one issue that could potentially happen is if you have, for example, two assignations which would give exactly the same objective value. Instead of stabilizing, there might be like very unlikely cases where the k-means would kind of eventually alternate between these two equivalent clusters, but we'll just disregard these possibilities we haven't discussed. So let's assume it just always converges and becomes stable eventually. Okay, so as we said, the solution might depend on the initial cluster allocation. So when you do that in practice, it's recommended not to run the algorithm only once, but try to pick various initializations of the clusters and get results from these various initializations, and then compare the solutions you obtain. And across all these solutions you've obtained, pick the best one which leads to the smallest objective function. Okay, so that's good. We discussed the k-means algorithm for a fixed value of capital K, the number of clusters. So in practice, relevant questions would be how do you choose capital K? How do you choose a proper number of clusters? Well, one approach is simply to use judgment. Okay, so you can say that, well, for some reasons, for the context of that problem, I might need 4 clusters or 3 clusters. So you can pick that based on your problem. Or judgment is like you try the results with various values of k, and then based on the results you've obtained, you can look at which k gives the more meaningful solutions based on your needs and use this. Alternatively, and this is out of scope, I haven't mentioned that in the slides, but in the literature there were some type of criteria developed to try to determine the optimal number of k, but I'd say these criteria are somewhat subjective in the sense that there's no single criterion that provides better answer to this question than others. So ultimately, it's, in my mind, it still remains an objective choice. Okay, so we need to choose k in practice. It's not necessarily straightforward. So what we're going to do next we won't do that now. We'll do it in the next lecture, but we'll study a clustering algorithm which is called hierarchical clustering, where instead of selecting k at the onset, we will select the number of clusters after running the hierarchical clustering algorithm, and this allows to compare results from the various values of k in a very seamless and natural manner. But this we will study that in the next lecture. So thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.